Work Package 4, Understanding Farm Advisory Regimes. WP4 of AgriLink is focused on studying the institutions of farm advisory regimes in European contexts. The aim is to integrate two levels of analysis. Firstly, we analyse the changes linked to new sources of advice in farmers' micro-AKIS. Secondly, we depict changes in advisory policies. In the advisory landscape, we highlight a growing pluralism of advisors. At the same time, public policies target advice to support sustainable transition of agriculture, whereas private actors have invested in the sector for several decades. The goal is to better understand changes in advisory services institutions linked to the dynamics of innovation areas. Can we identify convergences or discrepancies with regard to the policies? In AgriLink, we seek to understand the institutions, namely the rules, norms and procedures that frame advisory activities. We also focus on the institutional changes that occur while new actors are entering the advice landscape. We focus on 5 dimensions describing farm advisory regimes: identities, attributes, financing, boundaries, and monitoring. Who is entitled to provide farm advice? What are the institutions defining the identity of those who can assume this activity? How is farm advice built? What are the institutions that define its making? How do advisors and their organizations work to provide a high-quality service? What are the institutions defining the cost of farm advice? Does the farmer have to pay for membership or a direct fee for services? Is the farm advice free of charge? Is it coupled with a commercial transaction of other goods or services? The institutions that govern farm advice are not universal. At which geographical level, national, regional, local, are formal rules, public policies or contracts created and enforced? Do they apply at sector level, agriculture globally, or for subsectors or supply chains? Is there any control or monitoring of the quality of farm advice? Does it lead to any sanctions? Is there any authority that enforces the institutions defining the preceding dimensions? To reach our objective, we undertook 3 tasks consecutively. First, we realised a description of national policies in each country. The second task consisted in a comparative assessment of the implementation of the EU FAS policy in 16 countries. Finally, we conducted in-depth studies in 7 countries. First, we realised a description of national policies in each country, resulting in a short fact sheet describing the history of the national farm advice policy, the key objective of the current regional farm advisory policy, and an overview of advisory public policies and their impact on regimes. Secondly, we carried out a comparative assessment of the implementation of the EU FAS policy in 16 EU countries, with a focus on the question of the consequences of EU FAS on farmers' access to advisory services. We based our approach on existing material on assessment of farm advisory systems in Europe and on our previous inputs from the previous stages of the AgriLink programme. To learn more about inputs of the Work Package 2, have a look at innovation case studies in focus regions on the website. Finally, we conducted an in-depth study of governance models of farm advice systems in 7 countries: Czech Republic, Greece, France, Poland, Portugal, United Kingdom and Spain. We aimed to understand institutional changes through surveys and interviews of advisory suppliers in various innovation areas. The sample included a large variety of stakeholders involved in the advisory regime of each country: private suppliers from downstream and upstream industry, farm-based organisations, independent consultants, public organisations and NGOs. Technological innovation, by studying change in the supply of advisory services related to digital technologies. Marketing innovation, by studying changes in the supply and advisory services related to the introduction of new crops and to the reintroduction of a dairy product. Process innovation, by studying changes in the supply of advisory services related to the support of the adoption of agroecological practices, such as biological pest control and sustainable soil management. Organisational and social innovation, by studying changes in advisory services related to the support of new labour arrangements, or collective management of common natural resources by farmers. The first step was to describe changes in the supply of services. We paid specific attention to the changes induced by the practitioners. Who owns the advisory supplier? What does it provide? What is the place of advice in the organisation provider? How do the practices change? How and by whom are the advisors trained? Which are the organisations that invest in back office? What are the main advisory methods used? What kind of networks are emerging? Crossing a top-down and bottom-up approach allows us to discuss the convergence and the discrepancy between the policy level and the application one. This analysis helps us to identify actions and mechanisms to improve the effectiveness of back-office activities of advisory services. Our results show some tendencies in the transformations of the supply of advisory services in various innovation areas. It highlights that the diversity of advice suppliers is broader than expected. Organisations that are not specialised in advisory services play an important role. Such actors could potentially be change agents of the institutions of farm advice. These suppliers are often embedded economically in innovation areas. They provide advice services jointly with other services. The main types of actors identified across cases are input suppliers, machinery dealers, nursery, and the main types of actors are association of producers, NGOs, bookkeepers, consultants, high-tech companies, and research organisations and researchers. In parallel with this broadening of the actors, we note that the methods of advice remain homogeneous. For instance, in all countries analysed, the main practice of advice is through face-to-face meetings and interpersonal interactions. Moreover, the advice remains free of cost. The producer doesn't need to pay in order to receive advice. Despite being in the same country, the situation can differ strongly from one innovation area to another. For technological and marketing innovation, actors of the supply chain, such as industries, cooperatives, traders, might be important change agents. In process or social innovation, actors such as NGOs could play this role. More subtle institutional changes are emerging. The diverse suppliers that are emerging and adding to the advice regime occupy a gap left by the public sector. These actors are often overlooked in policy design. The major changes are found in the back office of these new actors, who use different sources of knowledge and training. In particular, the disconnection is growing with public research. This discrepancy between the two levels of observation and the actual changes observed on the ground should not be ignored. Should it be, policymakers might face three major risks. First, informing their policies with an official definition of advisors and of the perimeter of advisory services that would not acknowledge that the actual perimeter of organisations and people who are a source of advice for the farmers is much wider. The second risk, overlooking the dynamics of privatisation of the back office of services and its consequences for the content of the knowledge that is actually used for farm advice. And the final risk, to consolidate vicious circles of increasing exclusion of certain groups of rural populations from the access to relevant knowledge and services.